2 days after my husband's funeral, my daughter asked for my house keys. At the time, I thought it was the kindest thing anyone had offered me all week. Looking back now, I wish I had paid more attention to the feeling in my stomach when she asked. Not because she sounded suspicious. Not because she seemed nervous. Quite the opposite. She sounded completely comfortable. Too comfortable. My name is Dorothy Hayes. I am 72 years old, and for 48 years, I was married to a man named William. We built a life together in a modest white house at the end of a quiet street in Ohio. We raised one daughter, Rebecca. We celebrated birthdays, graduations, anniversaries, and ordinary Tuesdays. Like many couples, we assumed there would always be more time. Then one spring morning, there wasn't. William passed away peacefully in his sleep. One day, he was sitting beside me drinking coffee and complaining about the weather forecast. The next day, I was choosing a suit for his funeral. Grief does strange things to the mind. Some moments feel painfully sharp. Others pass in a blur. The funeral itself felt like walking through fog. People hugged me. They offered condolences. They brought casseroles and flowers and sympathy cards. I thanked everyone, but very little seemed real. The only thing that felt solid was the empty space beside me. Rebecca was wonderful during those first 2 days. At least, that is what I believed. She handled phone calls, organized meals, helped coordinate relatives arriving from out of town. More than once I found myself thinking how fortunate I was to have such a devoted daughter. On the second evening after the funeral, she arrived carrying 2 bags of groceries and a warm smile. "Mom," she said gently, "you should not be dealing with everything alone." I remember feeling grateful just hearing those words. We sat together at the kitchen table where William and I had eaten breakfast almost every morning for decades. The house felt painfully quiet. Every room seemed filled with memories. Rebecca reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Let me help." I nodded. "You already are." She smiled. Then she asked the question that would eventually change everything. "Do you still have all the house keys?" At the time, it sounded completely reasonable. Family members had been stopping by constantly. Neighbors were helping. People came and went carrying food, flowers, and paperwork. "I think so," I said. "Why?" Rebecca shrugged casually. "Just in case you ever need anything. What if you get sick? Or cannot get to the door? It would be smart if I had a copy." Looking back, I cannot believe how quickly I agreed. But grief lowers defenses. It makes trust feel easier than thinking. 20 minutes later, I handed her a set of keys. "Front door, back door, garage." She slipped them into her purse and smiled. "One less thing for you to worry about." That night, after she left, I sat alone in the living room looking at William's favorite chair. His reading glasses still rested on the side table beside it. The television remote remained exactly where he left it. For several minutes, I cried harder than I had cried at the funeral. Then exhaustion finally carried me to bed. The following morning, Rebecca arrived before breakfast. "I thought I would help sort paperwork," she said. Again, the offer sounded thoughtful, loving, necessary. Insurance forms, bank statements, utility bills, death certificates. There seemed to be an endless mountain of documents. Having another pair of hands felt like a blessing. Together we spent hours organizing folders. Rebecca took notes, made phone calls, created lists. Every time I thanked her, she smiled and said the same thing. That is what daughters are for. By the end of the week, I trusted her more than ever. If a bank called, Rebecca answered. If a letter arrived, Rebecca opened it. If paperwork needed filing, Rebecca volunteered immediately. People in town praised her constantly. "You are lucky to have her," one neighbor told me. I agreed. Completely. Yet somewhere beneath the grief, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the gratitude, a small voice kept whispering that something felt different. Not wrong, just different. I ignored it. After all, what kind of mother suspects her own daughter during the worst moment of her life? The answer, I would later discover, is the kind of mother who should have listened to that voice much sooner. For the first few weeks after William's funeral, I barely noticed anything unusual. Grief has a way of narrowing your focus. Some mornings, simply getting dressed felt like an accomplishment. Other days, I would walk into a room and forget why I entered. Through all of it, Rebecca remained constantly present. She called every morning, stopped by several times a week, offered to help with everything from groceries to paperwork. Anyone looking from the outside would have called her a devoted daughter. I certainly did. Every time someone praised her kindness, I agreed. Yet small things began happening that I could not quite explain. The first incident seemed insignificant. A bank statement arrived in the mail. I placed it on the kitchen counter beside several other envelopes and planned to review it later. That evening, when I sat down with a cup of tea, the statement was gone. At first, I assumed I had misplaced it. Grief makes people absent-minded. I searched the kitchen, then the dining room, then my office. Nothing. The missing envelope bothered me for a few minutes before I convinced myself it was not important. A week later, another piece of mail disappeared. This time it was a notice from an investment company William and I had used for years. I remembered placing it on the hall table near the front door. The next day, it was nowhere to be found. Again, I blamed myself. Again, I let it go. Then a third envelope vanished. By that point, I began paying attention. One afternoon, I stood in my kitchen staring at a stack of unopened mail while trying to understand why something felt wrong. The envelopes themselves were ordinary. Utility bills, insurance information, financial statements. Yet I suddenly realized most of the missing mail shared one thing in common. It involved money. The thought unsettled me. Not because I suspected anyone. Because I did not want to. Rebecca continued helping with paperwork almost daily. She created folders, organized documents, answered phone calls. More than once, she gently suggested that I should let her handle stressful matters. "Mom, you have enough on your mind," she would say. "Let me deal with it." At the time, her concern felt genuine. Looking back, I realize how often she repeated those words. One morning, about a month after the funeral, I received a phone call from a representative at my bank. The conversation started normally. Verification questions, account information. Then the representative mentioned a recent inquiry regarding account access. I frowned. What inquiry? There was a brief pause. Someone called regarding authorization details. My confusion deepened. I did not call. The representative apologized and explained that the matter had already been resolved. The call ended politely, but the uneasiness remained. I sat at my desk for several minutes afterward staring at nothing. Why would someone contact the bank about authorization details? The question lingered throughout the day. That evening, Rebecca stopped by carrying dinner. We ate together in the kitchen while discussing ordinary things. Neighbors, family friends, upcoming appointments. Several times, I almost mentioned the bank call. Each time I stopped myself. I could not explain why. Perhaps I feared sounding paranoid. Perhaps I simply wanted to believe everything was fine. A few days later, I noticed something else. Rebecca seemed to know about certain documents before I mentioned them. "Did the insurance company finally send that packet?" she asked one afternoon. I blinked. "How did you know they mailed it?" She smiled casually. "I just assumed." The explanation sounded reasonable. Yet something about the exchange lingered in my thoughts. Over the following week, similar moments occurred again. Small comments, small assumptions, small details she seemed to know before I shared them. Individually, none of it proved anything. Together, they created a quiet discomfort I could no longer ignore. One rainy afternoon, while cleaning out a drawer in William's old desk, I found a notebook where he recorded household reminders. Near the back, a sentence written in his familiar handwriting caught my attention. "Trust people, but verify important things." I smiled sadly when I read it. That sounded exactly like him. Practical, careful, thoughtful. I closed the notebook and stared out the window at the rain. For the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had been avoiding. What if my uneasiness was not grief? What if it was instinct? The question stayed with me long after the rain stopped. And although I still trusted my daughter completely, a small part of me had finally begun paying attention. Over the next several weeks, I started paying closer attention to things I would normally ignore. Not because I wanted to catch anyone doing something wrong. Because once a question enters your mind, it becomes difficult to stop looking for answers. The missing mail continued. Not every day, not every week, just often enough to keep bothering me. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and found Rebecca standing beside the counter sorting through a stack of envelopes. She smiled when she saw me. "Just organizing things for you." The explanation sounded harmless. Yet something about the scene unsettled me. Perhaps it was the way she quickly gathered the papers together. Or perhaps it was simply the memory of the missing bank statements. Either way, I found myself watching more carefully. Around that same time, I received another call from the bank. This one was shorter than the first. The representative wanted to verify a recent request involving account documentation. My confusion returned immediately. What request? I asked. There was a brief pause. A request for copies of account records. My grip tightened around the phone. I did not make any request. The representative apologized and explained that someone had inquired about obtaining documents, but that no changes had been processed. When the call ended, I sat motionless at my kitchen table. For the first time, my concern became something stronger. Not suspicion exactly. Unease. Deep unease. That evening, Rebecca stopped by carrying dinner as she often did. We ate together while discussing ordinary things. At one point, she casually mentioned that financial matters could become complicated after a spouse passes away. That is why it helps to have family involved, she said. I nodded politely, but her comment lingered in my mind. Later that night, I found myself opening the filing cabinet William always used for important records. He was meticulous about paperwork, insurance policies, investment statements, property records. Everything had a place. As I reviewed the folders, I noticed something strange. Several documents I remembered seeing only weeks earlier were missing. Not all of them, just enough to stand out. I checked again, then a third time. The result never changed. The folders contained gaps, empty spaces where papers should have been. I sat back in my chair and stared at the cabinet. William used to joke that paperwork tells a story if you know how to read it. At that moment, it felt as though part of the story had been removed. The following weekend, my granddaughter Emily visited unexpectedly. At 18, she had grown into a thoughtful young woman with an honest face that made it difficult for her to hide anything. We spent the afternoon drinking tea and looking through family photographs. At one point, she mentioned helping her mother organize documents a few weeks earlier. The comment caught my attention immediately. What kind of documents? I asked casually. Emily shrugged. Bank stuff, I think. My heart skipped slightly. Bank stuff? Yeah. She reached for another photograph. Mom said she was trying to make things easier for you. The answer sounded innocent enough. Yet something about it stayed with me. Did she say anything else? Emily thought for a moment. Not really. Then she paused, although she seemed frustrated. I looked up. Frustrated. Emily nodded. She kept saying Grandpa should have simplified everything before he passed away. The room suddenly felt very quiet. William was many things, but disorganized was not one of them. Nothing about his affairs required simplifying. After Emily left, I sat alone in the living room as evening settled across the house. The silence felt heavier than usual. On the coffee table rested a small stack of mail that had arrived earlier that day. Without thinking, I began sorting through it. Most of it was routine. Advertisements, utility information, community newsletters. Then I noticed one envelope addressed to me from a law office I did not recognize. The return address was local. Curious, I opened it. Inside was a letter regarding documentation connected to a financial matter. At first, I assumed it had been sent by mistake. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Alongside my name appeared Rebecca's. I read the page twice. Then a third time. I still did not fully understand what I was looking at. But one thing was immediately clear. My daughter's name had appeared in conversations and paperwork I knew nothing about. As I sat there holding the letter beneath the soft light of the living room lamp, a realization settled over me. The missing envelopes, the bank calls, the disappearing records, the comments from Rebecca, the documents Emily mentioned. For weeks, I had been collecting puzzle pieces without realizing it. And for the first time, I could see part of the picture forming. That letter sat on my coffee table for 2 days before I showed it to anyone. Not because I was afraid of what it meant, because I was afraid of what it might confirm. Every time I walked past it, I found myself glancing at Rebecca's name printed beside mine. The law office was legitimate. The reference numbers were real. Yet the document referred to discussions I knew nothing about. Discussions involving financial matters connected to William's estate. By the third morning, curiosity finally overcame hesitation. I called the number listed at the top of the page. The receptionist transferred me to an attorney named Charles Whitman. He sounded professional and courteous. After verifying my identity, he paused for several seconds. Mrs. Hayes, he said carefully, I was under the impression you were already aware of these discussions. My stomach tightened immediately. What discussions? Another pause followed. Several inquiries regarding estate-related documentation. I gripped the phone more tightly. I have not authorized anyone to discuss my affairs. The silence on the other end seemed to stretch forever. Finally, he cleared his throat. I see. The conversation that followed raised more questions than answers. Charles refused to discuss confidential details without additional verification, but one thing became clear. Someone had been asking questions about matters connected to William's estate. Questions that suggested access to information I had never provided. When the call ended, I sat motionless at my kitchen table. Outside, sunlight filtered through the trees. Inside, everything felt different. For weeks, I had been trying to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation. That I was grieving. That I was imagining patterns where none existed. The attorney's reaction made that increasingly difficult. That afternoon, Rebecca stopped by carrying groceries. She smiled the moment she entered the kitchen. I picked up your favorite soup. Normally, I would have thanked her immediately. Instead, I found myself studying her face. The same face I had watched grow from childhood into adulthood. The same daughter I trusted completely. Everything okay? She asked. Fine, I replied. The word felt strange coming out of my mouth. As she unpacked groceries, I noticed something else. Rebecca moved through my house with complete confidence. Opening cabinets, sorting papers, rearranging items. She looked less like a guest and more like someone who believed she belonged there. The observation unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Later that evening, after she left, I opened William's desk again. This time I searched more carefully, folder by folder, drawer by drawer. Near the back of a filing cabinet, I discovered something unexpected. A copy of an estate planning summary prepared several years earlier. Most of the information was familiar. Then I noticed handwritten notes in the margins. William's handwriting. My eyes stopped on one sentence. Dorothy must always retain direct control. I read the line twice. Then a third time. Something about it felt significant. William had always been careful, deliberate. He rarely wrote instructions unless he considered them important. The next morning, Emily called unexpectedly. We chatted briefly about school before she hesitated. Grandma. Yes. Can I ask you something? Her tone immediately caught my attention. Of course. She lowered her voice. Have you and Mom been arguing? My heart skipped slightly. Why would you ask that? Because she has been stressed lately. Emily sounded uncertain. Every time paperwork comes up, she gets frustrated. I remained silent. Last week, she said everything would be easier if people would just cooperate. The statement lingered in my mind. Easier for whom? After we ended the call, I walked through the quiet house thinking about that question. Easier for whom? Rebecca insisted she was helping. The attorney assumed I knew about discussions I had never authorized. Documents were disappearing. Questions were being asked. And now even Emily noticed tension connected to paperwork. That evening, while sorting through another stack of mail, I discovered an envelope tucked between magazines. It had been opened already. My name appeared on the front. Inside was correspondence referencing documentation that required signatures. As I scanned the page, a chill moved through me. At the bottom, someone had written a note in blue ink. Not my handwriting. Not William's. Rebecca's. For the first time since the funeral, I stopped wondering whether something was wrong. The question was no longer if. The question had become how much. For the next several days, I carried that opened envelope with me from room to room. Not because I needed to read it again. I had already memorized every line. What unsettled me was the handwritten note at the bottom. Rebecca's handwriting. Clear. Familiar. Undeniable. It was not merely the fact that she had seen the document. It was the realization that she had seen it before I did. The thought lingered in my mind every time I looked at her. Every time she called. Every time she asked whether I needed help. One afternoon, I decided to do something I had avoided since William passed away. I made an appointment with the attorney who helped prepare our estate documents years earlier. His name was Thomas Reynolds, and he had known both of us for nearly 2 decades. When I arrived at his office, he greeted me warmly and expressed his condolences once again. Then he noticed the folder I was carrying. Something on your mind? He asked. I nodded. Quite a few things. For nearly an hour, we reviewed documents together. Account records. Estate summaries. Correspondence. The farther we went, the quieter Thomas became. Finally, he removed his glasses and leaned back in his chair. Dorothy, there is something I need to ask. All right. Did you authorize anyone to act on your behalf after William passed away? The question immediately tightened my chest. No, he nodded slowly. That is what I thought. A long silence followed. Why? Thomas slid a document across the desk. Because several inquiries were made that suggested someone believed they had authority to discuss matters connected to your estate. I stared at the paper. Rebecca? He chose his words carefully. I cannot speak to intentions. Only actions. Intentions. Actions. The distinction mattered. Yet in that moment, it felt impossible to separate them. When I left the office, the afternoon sun felt unusually bright. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine. For months, I had been questioning myself. Now, for the first time, someone else had quietly confirmed that my concerns were not imaginary. Later that evening, Emily stopped by unexpectedly. She was carrying a school project and wanted help reviewing it. We sat at the kitchen table together while discussing college applications and future plans. Then, halfway through the conversation, she said something that made me pause. Mom and Dad have been talking about moving. I looked up immediately. Moving? Emily nodded. A larger house. My surprise must have shown because she added, they have been looking at listings for months. Months. The word echoed in my mind. Rebecca had been discussing larger houses while helping me sort through estate paperwork, while managing documents, while asking questions, while encouraging me to let her handle things. Do they have a place already? I asked carefully. Emily shrugged. Not yet. Then she smiled. Mom says things will get easier once everything is settled. There was that phrase again. Settled. I heard it before. Rebecca used it. Emily repeated it. Even the attorney's documents hinted at it. Yet nobody seemed willing to define exactly what it meant. That night, after Emily left, I sat alone in William's old chair. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock in the hallway. I picked up a framed photograph from our 40th wedding anniversary and studied it carefully. William had always trusted people, but he never ignored facts. If something felt wrong, he investigated. Not because he expected betrayal, because he respected reality. I suddenly realized I had been doing the opposite. I kept ignoring reality because I could not bear the possibility of betrayal. The next morning, I began organizing every document I could find. Bank statements, letters, notes, estate records, missing envelopes, phone logs. Not because I planned a confrontation, because I needed clarity. Piece by piece, a timeline began emerging. Certain events matched certain inquiries. Certain missing documents aligned with specific conversations. The pattern was still incomplete, but it was becoming visible. As evening approached, my phone rang. Rebecca. I stared at the screen before answering. Hi, Mom. Her voice sounded cheerful. Normal. Hello. I was thinking about stopping by tomorrow. I looked at the stack of papers spread across my dining room table. Why? A brief pause followed. Just checking on you. The answer sounded reasonable. Yet for the first time, I found myself wondering whether that was really why. After we ended the call, I returned to the documents. Somewhere inside that growing pile of paperwork was the truth. I could feel it. And for the first time since William's funeral, I was no longer afraid to find it. The next morning, I woke up with a feeling I had not experienced in months. Determination. Not anger. Not revenge. Determination. For too long, I had allowed confusion to keep me passive. Now I had enough pieces of the puzzle to justify asking difficult questions. Before Rebecca arrived, I organized every document I had collected. Bank statements, letters, notes from conversations, records from the attorney, missing paperwork I had reconstructed through copies. Everything sat neatly arranged across my dining room table. Looking at it all together was startling. What once felt like isolated incidents now formed a pattern. Shortly after 10 o'clock, Rebecca knocked on the front door. She entered carrying coffee and pastries, smiling as usual. Good morning, Mom. Good morning. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then her eyes landed on the papers spread across the table. The smile faded slightly. What is all this? She asked. I gestured toward a chair. Sit down. The room suddenly felt smaller. Rebecca hesitated before sitting. Mom, what is going on? I took a slow breath. I spoke with Thomas Reynolds. Her expression changed immediately. Not dramatically, just enough. A brief tightening around the eyes. A slight pause. Oh, he had questions. Silence. Questions about what? I looked directly at her. Estate inquiries. The room became very still. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Rebecca laughed softly. Mom, if this is about paperwork, I was only trying to help. Help. The same word she had used for months. Then perhaps you can explain why legal offices assumed you had authority to discuss matters I never authorized. Rebecca's posture stiffened. I was handling things for you. Without telling me. Another silence followed. You were grieving. The answer sounded rehearsed, convenient, yet something about it felt incomplete. And the missing documents? I asked. What documents? The bank statements, the investment notices, the records that disappeared. Rebecca crossed her arms. I do not know what you are talking about. The denial came too quickly, too smoothly. I felt disappointment settle heavily in my chest. Not because I expected a confession, because I hoped for honesty. Rebecca, my voice remained calm. I am not accusing you of anything. I am asking for the truth. For a moment, she looked away. Then she stood. I cannot believe this. The frustration in her voice seemed genuine. After everything I have done for you. There it was. The sentence that appears whenever accountability becomes uncomfortable. I remained seated. This is not about gratitude. Then what is it about? She demanded. I looked at the stack of papers. Trust. The word hung between us. Rebecca stared at me for several seconds. Then she sat down again. The anger in her expression softened slightly. What appeared next looked more like exhaustion. You do not understand, she said quietly. Then help me understand. Another long silence followed. Finally, she spoke. After Dad died, I was terrified. The admission surprised me. Terrified of what? She looked down at her hands. Everything. Her voice shook slightly. You being alone. The house. The finances. The future. I listened carefully. I kept thinking something would go wrong if nobody took control. Control. The word immediately caught my attention. Not help. Not support. Control. Rebecca continued speaking. Every time I saw another document, another account, another decision, I felt responsible. She laughed bitterly. Maybe too responsible. For the first time, I began hearing something beyond the defensiveness. Fear. Real fear. Yet fear alone did not explain everything. Did you discuss matters without my permission? I asked. Rebecca hesitated. Sometimes. Did you open mail addressed to me? Another pause. Sometimes. The answers were small, but they mattered. More importantly, they confirmed what I already suspected. Boundaries had been crossed. Not accidentally. Intentionally. As the conversation continued, one thing became increasingly clear. Rebecca genuinely believed she was protecting something. The problem was that she never stopped to ask whether I wanted that kind of protection. By the time she left that afternoon, neither of us felt victorious. The questions were no longer whether something happened. The questions had become why. And deep down, I sensed there was still one piece of the story missing. One piece Rebecca had not told me yet. After Rebecca left that afternoon, I sat alone at the dining room table staring at the stack of documents between us. The conversation had answered some questions, but not the most important one. Fear explained why she became involved. It did not explain why she crossed lines. It did not explain why mail disappeared. It did not explain why legal offices believed she had authority she never possessed. Most of all, it did not explain why she kept so much hidden. The following morning, I received an unexpected visitor. Emily arrived carrying a backpack and an expression I had never seen on her face before. She looked nervous. Grandma, can we talk? The seriousness in her voice immediately caught my attention. We sat in the kitchen with cups of tea between us. For several moments, she simply stared at the steam rising from her mug. Finally, she spoke. Mom and Dad have been arguing for months. I nodded slowly. That part no longer surprised me. About money? Emily hesitated. Partly. Then she lowered her voice. But mostly about Grandpa's estate. My stomach tightened. What do you mean? Emily looked down. Mom thought certain things would eventually become simpler. There was that word again. Simpler. Settled. Easier. The language never changed. Simpler how? I asked. Emily took a deep breath. She believed she would eventually be handling most of it. The room fell silent. Not because the statement shocked me, because it confirmed something I had been slowly realizing. Rebecca was not acting like someone temporarily helping her grieving mother. She was acting like someone preparing to take control. Did your mother tell you this? Emily shook her head. No, she looked uncomfortable. I overheard conversations. I remained silent. Dad kept telling her to slow down. That detail surprised me. Until then, I had assumed Mark remained mostly uninvolved. Your father said that? Emily nodded. A lot. Another piece of the story clicked into place. What happened? Emily stared into her tea. Mom kept saying she was protecting the family. Protecting the family. I had heard those exact words before. Rebecca used them during our conversation. Yet something about them never felt completely honest. Because real protection rarely requires secrecy. Grandma, Emily said quietly, I do not think Mom started out trying to hurt anyone. I believe that. Strangely, it made everything worse. If Rebecca acted out of greed alone, the story would have been easier to understand. Instead, it seemed she had convinced herself that crossing boundaries was justified because she believed she knew what was best. After Emily left, I spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing records. For the first time, I stopped looking for isolated incidents and started looking for patterns. The results were unsettling. Every questionable action pointed in the same direction. More access, more information, more control. It was never about one account or one document. It was about gradually positioning herself at the center of decisions that belonged to someone else. That evening, I received a call from Thomas Reynolds. Dorothy, he said carefully, I found something you should see. The next morning, I met him at his office. He handed me several copies of correspondence connected to earlier inquiries. Most of it was routine. Then I noticed something that made my chest tighten. Certain communications referenced assumptions about future authority. Not current authority, future authority. Rebecca had not merely been managing paperwork. She had been planning around a future she believed would eventually belong to her. Thomas folded his hands on the desk. This is where I think things became complicated. I looked up. Complicated. People sometimes begin making decisions based on what they expect will happen rather than what is actually true. His words stayed with me. Expectations. That was the missing piece. Rebecca was not responding to reality. She was responding to assumptions. Assumptions about inheritance. Assumptions about responsibility. Assumptions about what she believed she deserved. When I returned home, I found myself standing in William's study. His books lined the shelves exactly as he left them. His reading lamp sat beside the chair he used every evening. For a moment, I imagined what he would say if he could see all this. The answer came almost immediately. He would tell me to stop guessing and start dealing with facts. Facts were finally becoming clear. Rebecca had crossed boundaries. She had hidden information. She had acted without permission. But perhaps most importantly, she had convinced herself she was entitled to do it. And now, for the first time, I understood the real problem. The issue was not what Rebecca had done. The issue was that she still believed she had been right. The next few days were the quietest of my life. Not because nothing happened, because I finally stopped reacting and started preparing. Every document I had gathered was copied, organized, and stored safely. Bank records sat in one folder. Estate documents in another. Notes from attorneys. Missing correspondence. Everything had a place. For the first time since William passed away, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt certainty. Rebecca called twice during that week. I kept the conversations polite. Short. Ordinary. She spoke about grocery shopping, community events, and family news. I listened carefully. What struck me most was how normal she sounded. As though nothing unusual had happened. As though months of hidden decisions, missing documents, and unauthorized discussions existed only in my imagination. The contrast became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, Thomas Reynolds called. Dorothy, he said, I have finished reviewing everything. I sat down immediately, and a brief silence followed. You were right to ask questions. The words landed heavily. Not because they surprised me anymore, because they confirmed what I already knew. Thomas explained that while no permanent changes had been finalized, numerous inquiries and preliminary actions had occurred without my direct authorization. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing irreversible. Yet enough to demonstrate a clear pattern. Someone was acting as though future authority already existed, he said carefully. Future authority. Again, the phrase appeared everywhere. It had become the foundation beneath everything Rebecca did. That evening, I received another visit from Emily. We sat together in the kitchen drinking tea while sunlight faded beyond the windows. After a long silence, she finally spoke. Mom knows you have been asking questions. I looked at her calmly. I assumed she did. Emily stared down at her cup. She is angry. The statement should have upset me. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Angry about what? Emily laughed softly. She says people are making her look like the villain. I did not respond. Sometimes silence reveals more than arguments ever could. After several moments, Emily added something else. Dad disagrees with her now. That caught my attention. Really? She nodded. They argue about it constantly. For the first time, I felt sympathy for Mark. He had spent months trapped between loyalty and reality. Neither position was comfortable. The following weekend, Rebecca called and asked if she could come over. Her voice sounded different, tighter, more controlled. "We need to talk," she said. "I agree," I replied. We settled on Sunday afternoon. When the day arrived, I spent the morning preparing the dining room table. Not for a meal, for the truth. Every document sat arranged in neat folders. Every question had supporting records. Every concern had evidence. No accusations. No assumptions. Facts. At exactly 2 o'clock, Rebecca walked through the front door. She immediately noticed the folders. "What is all this?" she asked. "Please sit down." For a moment, she remained standing. Then she slowly pulled out a chair. The room felt unusually quiet. I opened the first folder and placed several documents between us. Rebecca's expression changed the moment she recognized them. Not panic. Recognition. "Where did you get those?" she asked. "That is not the important question." My voice remained calm. The important question is why they exist. For the next hour, we moved through the evidence piece by piece. Missing mail, bank inquiries, legal discussions, estate correspondence. Every time I presented a document, Rebecca found herself with fewer explanations. The confidence she carried into the room slowly disappeared. Finally, I placed the last folder on the table. The room fell silent. Rebecca stared at the papers for a long time. Then she looked at me. For the first time in months, there was no defensiveness in her eyes. Only realization. "You know everything," she whispered. I folded my hands calmly. "No," she frowned. "What?" "I know enough." The distinction mattered. Because this conversation was no longer about catching her. It was about confronting reality. Rebecca looked around the room as though searching for somewhere to escape. There was nowhere left to go. The truth sat openly between us. And for the first time since William's funeral, my daughter understood that I was no longer the grieving widow who handed over her house keys without question. I was the woman who finally saw the entire picture. Rebecca sat silently for what felt like an eternity. The folders remained spread across the dining room table between us like a map of every decision, every assumption, and every secret that had brought us to that moment. For the first time since William's funeral, neither of us had anywhere left to hide. Finally, she looked down at the documents and spoke. "I never meant for it to become this." Her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. I folded my hands and waited. "Then what did you mean for it to become?" The question lingered in the room. Rebecca stared at the papers for several seconds before answering. "After Dad died, everything felt uncertain." She swallowed hard. "I kept thinking about the future. The house. The finances. The responsibilities." I listened quietly. At first, I just wanted to understand what was happening. She laughed bitterly. Then understanding became involvement. Involvement became control. The honesty hurt, but it also brought clarity. "You stopped asking where the line was," I said softly. Rebecca nodded. "Yes." Tears filled her eyes. And after a while, I convinced myself I was helping. The room fell silent again. For months, I had imagined this conversation. In some versions, she denied everything. In others, she blamed everyone else. The truth turned out to be simpler and sadder. She had crossed boundaries because she believed she knew what was best. She had mistaken access for authority, concern for entitlement, love for control. "Mom," she said quietly, "I am sorry." I studied her face carefully. The apology did not erase what happened. It did not restore trust overnight. Yet it felt genuine. That mattered. "I believe you are sorry," I said. "But being sorry and being accountable are not the same thing." Rebecca nodded immediately. "I know." For the first time since William's death, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly. Peace. The kind that comes when confusion finally ends. Over the following weeks, changes were made. Access was corrected. Records were updated. Every question received an answer. Every document returned to its proper place. More importantly, expectations were reset. Rebecca no longer handled matters that belonged to me. Decisions returned to where they should have been all along. Mine. Surprisingly, the person most relieved by these changes was Emily. One afternoon, she stopped by with coffee and smiled as she looked around the house. "It feels different here now." "Different how?" I asked. She thought for a moment. "Lighter." I knew exactly what she meant. Secrets create weight. So does uncertainty. Once both disappeared, the entire family seemed able to breathe again. Several months later, as spring returned to Ohio, Rebecca invited me to dinner. It was a simple evening. No discussions about estates. No paperwork. No explanations. Just family. At one point, Emily laughed at something her mother said, and I caught Rebecca watching us with a thoughtful expression. Later, as she walked me to my car, she stopped beside the driveway. Mom. Yes. Her eyes filled with emotion. Thank you for not giving up on me. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. I came close, I admitted honestly. She nodded. I know. Then she smiled sadly. I am glad you did not. As I drove home beneath a sky painted with the colors of sunset, I thought about everything that had happened since William's funeral. The missing documents, the hidden conversations, the unanswered questions. For a long time, I believed the greatest loss of that year was my husband. In many ways, it was. But I nearly lost something else too. My trust in my own judgment. The moment I stopped ignoring my instincts was the moment everything began to change. Looking back now, I understand something important. Betrayal rarely arrives wearing a mask that says betrayal. It usually arrives disguised as good intentions, urgency, or concern. That is what makes it so difficult to recognize. Yet truth has a remarkable quality. Given enough time, it always finds its way to the surface. And on the day I finally placed those folders on the table, I did not reclaim money, documents, or control. I reclaimed my voice. The one thing I should never have handed over to anyone in the first place.